About 3 years ago, I made a video covering the timeline of electric suburban trains in Melbourne, and a lot of you took to the comments saying things like, "Please do Sydney," or "Do this for Brisbane." Well, I'm here to tell you that I read those comments and suddenly found myself writing about Adelaide. Then I got distracted for 3 years making some other stuff, and now, here we are. Adelaide's railway network has a really interesting history, and the suburban fleet has included a number of very unusual and unique train types over the years. It's the only network in Australia or New Zealand still using diesel railcars in widespread suburban service, and while the fleet does now include electric trains, future electrification of the network is still looking very uncertain. In this video, we're going to look at the different types of suburban train used in Adelaide since the end of the steam era, where you can see examples of them today, and what the future might hold for rail in the South Australian capital. Before we get stuck into it, just a quick note about the scope of this video. I'm talking about passenger rail cars which have operated in dedicated suburban service since the end of the steam era. I'm not covering things like the 75 class Brill rail cars, which did operate some suburban services but weren't built for that purpose, or country rail cars like the Bluebirds, which ran through the suburbs but aren't suburban trains. Alright, let's go. The Adelaide suburban network was entirely operated by steam up until the early 1950s, a decade in which the scrapping of steam locomotives was really gathering pace all around the world. This was a time when Melbourne and Sydney had already had electric trains for about 3 decades, but Adelaide wasn't a big place. Only about 500,000 people lived there in 1955. While electrification was certainly given some serious thought at that time, nothing came of it, and they went with the cheaper option, albeit with significantly more long-term costs, of diesel traction. The first diesel railcars built specifically for suburban service were constructed from 1955 and were nicknamed Red Hens. They were built in-house at the South Australian Railway's own Islington workshops. The Red Hens were built in 2 distinct types. The 300 class cars were single-ended, so always operated with at least one other car, while the 400 class were fitted with a driver's cab at each end, allowing single car operation. In addition to these new rail cars, a number of previously steam-hauled passenger cars were modified to run with the Red Hens as trailers. These included the 860 class steel-bodied cars, which had been built in the mid-1940s and were actually designed with possible conversion to electric multiple units in mind. The second type of trailer was the 820 class. These were wooden-bodied cars with a clerestory roof, end platforms and a large central baggage compartment, and really stood out as belonging to an earlier era. They'd been built between 1912 and 1924, so were already getting into their 40s at the beginning of their newfound careers. When first introduced, the single-ended 300 class always ran in pairs with a trailer in between, forming a 3-car set, which could then be coupled together as 6 cars during peak hours, while the 400 class handled most off-peak runs running as single cars. Initially, the 300 class actually had to have a trailer between them, because their multiple unit cables and sockets were only on one side at the rear of the car, and the trailer was needed to swap the cables over to the other side. However, as time went on, the Hens ran in all sorts of different configurations, from single cars right up to 7 cars in regular service, and as many as 9 cars on some special occasions. It was common to see a 2-car set made up of one 300 and one 400 class, and the 300s were later modified to have the cables on both sides, allowing 300-300 2-car sets to operate. Inside, the Red Hens had vinyl seats of various colours with an exposed metal frame, which doubled as a handhold, and the walls were painted in various pastel colours over the years. The driver sat in a small compartment occupying the front left corner of the car, with passengers able to stand right at the front and look out the offside window, enjoying an offset driver's eye view of the line ahead. And this layout is something that would stick with Adelaide suburban train design for many years to come. The sliding passenger doors were opened and closed manually, which meant that in practice they were often just left open while running, especially on hot days, which was a common experience on most Australian suburban trains during the 20th century. While the Red Hens were painted all over red for most of their lives, there were many small livery variations. Early on, the roofs were painted silver, with some later painted black, and some had unpainted silver doors. Some cars had a mixture of painted and unpainted doors, and all this combined to create a lot of variety, very appealing to railway modelers. The SAR Model Company makes an excellent kit for a Red Hen in HO scale, and I have an unbuilt 300 class pair which has been sitting in my unbuilt kits box for about 7 years. And since writing that last sentence in the script, I've also added an unbuilt 400 class to the box as well. Really need to get onto that. Another visually distinctive feature of the Red Hens was these orange-yellow stripy panels, which were added in 1957 and were illuminated at night. This was to improve the train's visibility to motorists and pedestrians, as Adelaide had a lot of poorly lit level crossings and also some small sections of street running. The stripy boards were removable, and there were a few different designs, so it wasn't uncommon to see cars with two slightly different boards or running with one missing completely. More fun variations for modelers. From 1967, the Red Hens also got these gold speed stripes at the cab end of each car, which obviously made them a lot faster. The name Red Hen presumably came about because they were, red, but there is an additional theory. The first cars to be built had the radiators mounted under the floor, which would apparently overheat when stopped alongside platforms, making a cackling sound like a hen. On later cars, the radiators were moved to the roof and the earlier cars modified to match. The Red Hens remained in service until the mid-90s and became a real Adelaide icon over their 4.5 decades of service. They achieved something not many trains do, actual recognition from the general public and broad public use of their nickname, well beyond the enthusiast community and railway employees who would normally be able to name a specific train type. This was certainly helped by their very distinctive appearance, but they certainly wouldn't be the last Adelaide train to stand out visually. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a Bud Metroliner and a Dutch Railways Koploper EMU had a baby? You have, haven't you? Well, that's basically the thought process that resulted in Adelaide's next type of suburban train, the 2000 and 2100 class Jumbo. The Jumbos are probably Australia's all-time strangest suburban train, and their unique design came about by an equally strange process. By the mid-1970s, there was some concern about the crashworthiness of the wooden 820 class Red Hen trailer cars. From 1973, they were restricted to 80 km per hour, which was actually only a slight reduction on the Red Hen's top speed of 90, and there was a strong push to withdraw them after a level crossing accident on the Gawler line in 1976. They were removed from service entirely in January 1977, shortly after the Granville disaster in Sydney, where a commuter train, made up of wooden passenger cars, derailed, bringing down a road bridge and killing 84 people, what is still Australia's deadliest rail disaster to date. The withdrawal of the 820 class left Adelaide with a rolling stock shortage, and a new modern type of train was urgently needed. Adelaide's suburban passenger operator, STA, the State Transport Authority, who had taken over from the South Australian Railways in 1975, had been chatting to their mates at the Western Australian Government Railways, who had written a report suggesting that locomotive-hauled trains were ultimately a better way to go than diesel multiple units. The logic for going with loco-hauled was that this allowed the purchase of standard passenger cars and, separately, standard diesel locomotives, and should Adelaide ever get around to electrifying, they could simply replace the locomotives and continue to use the same passenger cars. For suburban operation, there would have been a driving trailer or cab car at the other end of the train to avoid the need to run the locomotive around. A good example of what this might have looked like is the SA SD class passenger cars used in Auckland, New Zealand from the 90s to the 2010s. A conventional diesel-electric locomotive was at one end of the train, with the cab car at the other. However, in Adelaide, this idea quickly became complicated, because the railway union insisted that a diesel locomotive should always have a two-man crew, while they were happy for rail cars to be operated driver only. It seems they considered the cab cars closer in nature to a rail car, and were therefore happy for those to be operated driver only. So the proposed trains would require an additional crew member when running with the locomotive end leading, not exactly a sustainable way of operating. The STA's solution to this was to adjust the concept, moving the locomotive to be positioned mid-train, with a driving trailer at both ends. The locomotive would not be fitted with cabs to prevent it being incorrectly used as the leading vehicle. Another thing the union was pushing for was a full-width driver's cab, unlike the Red Hens, which had the small driver's compartment in the corner. However, a full-width cab was easier said than done, as the STA also wanted to have full walk-through access along the train, without passing through the cab. The solution to making these two things possible was an elevated driver's cab, which would be the full width of the car, while allowing the passenger compartment to extend right to the front, leading to an end door. So these rather convoluted specifications were put out to tender, and among the submissions came one from Commonwealth Engineering, ComEng, where they kind of said, "Hey guys, this is pretty weird. Are you sure you don't want to just go with a normal DMU?" I'm paraphrasing, but that was basically the gist of it. ComEng did their own analysis showing the cost-benefit of a DMU was significantly better than a loco-hauled train for suburban service, and a DMU could still be designed with future conversion to electric traction in mind. It seems the STA was basically convinced by this, but there was some concern from both parties that there could be legal trouble if the contract was awarded to Comeng to build a DMU when that wasn't what the tender specified. Comeng's solution was to create something in between. Their new pitch was essentially a DMU, with a mixture of powered and unpowered cars, all carrying passengers and all with a driver's cab at one end. However, to keep the spirit of the mid-train locomotive alive from the earlier specifications, as much equipment as possible was mounted on the power car, and it was fitted with 2 huge underfloor engines providing a combined 1,010 horsepower. For comparison, that's slightly more powerful than many standalone diesel locomotives, such as the 830 class Elcos, and close to double the power of something like a Melbourne Comeng motorcar. Mounting so much serious equipment on the car came at a big cost to passenger space, with these large exhaust columns passing through the middle of the passenger saloon, and this compartment at the rear of the car housing the auxiliary engine for onboard power, which they couldn't find space for under the floor. This led to the power cars only having 64 seats compared to 106 in the trailer cars. When the first power car was completed, it was put on the weighbridge at Dry Creek and found to weigh a quite remarkable 67 tonnes. For comparison, a Red Hen car weighs a little over 40 tonnes. The STA's chief mechanical engineer said,
"When they told me how much it weighed, I thought, hell, I hope the track can take it. One of the good things was that I was chief civil engineer as well as chief mechanical engineer, and I was able to keep to myself the fact that the axle load was far in excess of what I would have liked. That was disturbing."
For another comparison, a Victorian Railways T-Class is about the same weight with the same number of axles, so it's not an unprecedented axle load, but unlike a T-Class, a jumbo power car could easily have another 7 or 8 tonnes worth of passengers on board in addition to that, and we're also going to be hammering up and down the same sections of track each day at regular intervals. The power cars were classified as the 2000 class, with the driving trailers 2100. The bodies were built at Comeng's plant in Granville in suburban Sydney, with the fiberglass cabs and fronts being produced by a boat builder in Wyong, and after reading that it did occur to me that the cab does look a bit like a small upturned boat stuck to the roof. The partly finished cars were transferred all the way to Adelaide by rail via Broken Hill for final fit out in Adelaide at Dry Creek. This lengthy transfer required the cars to be mounted on standard gauge transfer bogies as far as Peterborough, where they could be placed on South Australia's 1600mm broad gauge system. The Jumbo's wide bodies exceeded the loading gauge over most of the route, requiring some careful planning. They were not allowed to pass other trains on a parallel track in many places, especially on the leg from Emu Plains over the Blue Mountains and out to Parkes. The Jumbos entered service in 1980 and represented a radical improvement for passengers with their modern air-conditioned interiors and striking external aesthetics, which were heavily inspired by the Bud Metroliners in the US. There was a very deliberate effort to make these cars visually striking. They could operate as a 2-car set, with 1 power car and 1 trailer car, but more commonly ran as 3 cars, with a single power car easily managing a pair of driving trailers. And in a hint to the original proposal, these sets were usually arranged with the power car in the middle. Both 2 and 3 car sets could be combined together in busy times to create 4 and 6 car sets. It's quite likely 5 cars happened too, although I couldn't find any photos of it. A very distinctive feature of these trains was the thick cloud of smoke that would erupt from the twin exhaust pipes on the power car when the driver opened the throttle suddenly. Sadly, I never took a video showing it, but I did take this one photo. While they had a design speed of 120 km per hour, and no doubt could have achieved that very easily, they were restricted to the existing suburban speed limit of 90. The nickname Jumbo came from their apparent resemblance to a Boeing 747 jumbo jet. The train is the one on the left. This is a bit of a tangent, but the Jumbos being numbered in the 2000 series represents a bit of a popular theme in the 1980s. It was a decade where railways were trying hard to modernise and claw back some of what they'd lost over the past 30 years to the private automobile. A lot of rolling stock purchases were very political, and there was this feeling of futurism around the number 2000, tied to the year 2000 being just around the corner, more or less. Over in New South Wales, the XPTs, possibly the most political train of all time, were also numbered in the 2000s, as were the new B-Class trams here in Melbourne. The other essential ingredient for modernism in the 80s was the colour orange, with the Jumbos and XPT both wearing it, while down here in Victoria we were aggressively splashing that colour over everything in sight. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the ultimate orange train, the TGV Sud-Est, was making headlines and would set a new world rail speed record of 380 km per hour 12 months after the Jumbos entered service. Just as a side note, the TGVs were later painted this comparatively boring grey colour, but somehow still managed to break their own record multiple times, right up to the current one of 574.8 km per hour in 2007. When introduced, the Jumbos had a large display on the front left, where the stairs for the driver's cab are, showing a code which specified the destination and stopping pattern. This was an alternative to the existing system used in South Australia, where trains displayed a small square board indicating their route. These were for the benefit of employees rather than passengers, and the system was discontinued in the late 80s. Most of the destination windows were plated over, but some cars avoided this right to the end of their lives, providing a view of various cables and stuff inside. In 1990, a couple of jumbo driving trailers were transferred to Ballarat in Victoria for some major structural repairs. The first one went over attached to a series of freight trains running via Mount Gambier and Geelong, but the next one ran via the main interstate line with a power car as a normal two-car set. From 2004, some of the cars received Adelaide Metro's new corporate yellow livery and an internal refurbishment. However, this program was never completed, and some cars retained the original orange front and the 90s brown tartan seats right to the end of their lives in the 2010s. I was lucky enough to spend a couple of days riding and photographing Jumbos in December 2013. By this stage, they were used at peak times only, running almost exclusively as three-car sets on the Gawler and Outer Harbour lines. However, I did see this two-car mixed livery set running on the Grange line. The last Jumbos were withdrawn from service in the middle of 2015. The Jumbos proved very popular with the public, and by comparison, the Red Hens were starting to look very dated. In 1981, consideration was given to a major refurbishment program to bring them up to modern expectations, and a three-car set made up of two 300 class and an 860 trailer was refurbished as a trial. The most striking part of this modification was the fitting of a jumbo-style elevated cab, and these cars became known as Superchooks. The two power cars were reclassified as the 2300 class, with the trailer car becoming a 2500 class. The Superchooks were fitted with corrugated stainless steel cladding to match the Jumbos. To be clear, this was just stuck to the existing body for aesthetic reasons only. And of course they got the all-important orange paint, bringing them right into the 1980s. Inside, they got new seats, fiberglass walls, and upgraded lighting. The trailer car had most of its 14 doors removed, leaving just 2 on each side. The power cars retained their original engines, just with a new transmission, and they remained electrically compatible with the existing Red Hen fleet. The Superchooks began testing in January 1983, sometimes as a three-car set, sometimes with a conventional Red Hen car attached, and sometimes as just the two power cars. They entered regular passenger service in June, and by all accounts were not very successful. The refurbishment had added a lot of additional weight, and the train struggled to maintain normal timetables. It often ran with a 400 class Red Hen power car attached to improve its performance. The project had also been quite costly, and the STA decided that refurbishing more Red Hens didn't really stack up compared to the option of ordering brand new trains, and the Superchooks were withdrawn in January 1993, exactly a decade since their first test run, and at a time when many conventional Red Hens were still in service. By the late 80s, the Red Hens were starting to get old and were still running the bulk of suburban services. It was time to order another new type of train. It seems that lessons had been learnt from the radical design of the Jumbo, and the specifications went back to something much more familiar and traditional, and something that could act as a much more direct drop-in replacement for the Red Hens. The contract was again given to Comenge, who started building the new trains at their factory in Dandenong in suburban Melbourne. The contract specified a high level of South Australian content in the build, so the body shells were transferred by rail to Adelaide for completion at Comenge's local facility in Dry Creek, and the first examples entered service in November 1987. Two types of car were built, just like the Red Hens, the double-ended 3000 class and the single-ended 3100 class. Those familiar with Melbourne's suburban trains will notice a strong family resemblance to Melbourne's Comenge EMUs, which had only just finished being built in the same Dandenong factory. While there are many differences between the two, the overall profile of the stainless steel sides is very similar, along with the design of the doors and windows, and something that specifically always stands out to me is the identical shape of the windowsills inside. Unlike the Melbourne cars, the 3000s have just 2 doors per side, but the doors are slightly wider, and the Adelaide cars are about 1.5 meters longer than the Melbourne ones. The bogies are the same as those used on the later built Melbourne cars fitted with disc brakes. However, the Adelaide version includes an additional and quite unusual feature. 1 bogie per car has a magnetic track brake, something that's common on trams but very rarely fitted to trains. The STA specified bulletproof glass for the passenger windows as protection against people throwing rocks, and occasionally apparently firing actual bullets at the trains. The legacy of this is that while the passenger saloon does stay pleasingly free of bullets, the thick glass never seems to be completely clear. As delivered, these cars were mostly plain silver with an orange front, orange still maintaining its status as colour of the future at that time, and there were a couple of orange and blue stripes at one end of each car. From 2002, they started receiving the yellow livery of new operator Adelaide Metro, which, intentionally or not, had a bit of a design callback to the original livery with the angled colours behind the cab. At some point, these cars gained the slightly unflattering nickname of Poxbox amongst some of the enthusiast community, often shortened to just Pox. But unlike Red Hen or Jumbo, it's not a name that ever caught on in a big way, and it's more common these days to hear the whole type just referred to as the 3000 class, including the 3100 class single-ended cars. The 3000s are diesel-electric rail cars with a diesel engine providing AC power to electric traction motors on one bogie. Making these cars diesel-electric rather than diesel-hydraulic, which is a lot more common for DMUs, was good future-proofing for a possible conversion to full electric traction in the future. Unusually for a diesel-electric setup, the original diesel engines fitted to these cars ran at a constant high speed, regardless of how much power was being drawn, meaning these cars were very noisy even when sitting still or coasting downhill. While a small number of Red Hens had been withdrawn with the introduction of the Jumbos, the arrival of the 3000 class allowed the complete withdrawal of the 860 class steel trailers by late 1987, as well as reducing the number of Red Hen power cars in service. The 3000s were very successful and very well liked by the public, so the STA decided they'd quite like some more to replace the remaining Red Hens. However, ComEng came back with a higher price than before, so the order went back out to tender, ultimately being won by Clyde Engineering, who negotiated to buy the design and tooling from ComEng. This was a win-win-win, as Clyde didn't have to design a train from scratch, ComEng would get some cash despite losing the contract, and STA would get the same design of car they were already running. However, by the time Clyde was ready to start construction, ComEng had been taken over by new owners who refused to honour the full deal, handing over some components but not the tooling, which Clyde then had to make themselves. So in the end, there wasn't quite as much winning as there could have been. The Clyde Engineering cars were built from 1992, also in Melbourne, at their facility in Somerton. Unlike the earlier order, this batch were built to a fully operational state in Melbourne, and even did some test runs north of Somerton on the North East Main Line. At this stage, the interstate line between Melbourne and Adelaide was still broad gauge the whole way, and these cars were delivered to Adelaide complete under their own power. Here we have a couple of photos by the late Western Langford showing a two-car set arriving into Sunshine from the north, where it will reverse direction before heading out on the main Western line towards South Australia. The last of these cars were built in 1996, by which time the Western line had been gauge converted, so I assume the last few cars had to go on temporary standard gauge transfer bogies. As promised, the second order of 3000 class allowed the complete withdrawal of the remaining Red Hens, which ran their last services in January 1996, after some 40 years of service. From 2018, the 3000s had the original constant speed engines replaced with new ones which ran at a variable speed dependent on load, like most other diesel electrics. This made them a lot quieter and presumably more fuel efficient. At the same time, they received a new red livery, replacing the yellow they'd worn for many years. Initially, they experimented with pairing the new colour with a stern black monobrow, later refined to a pair of silver grey eyebrows with a parted moustache. Actually, I'm not sure, maybe a moustache would be lower down. Let me know what you think. You can still tell which cars originally had the monobrow because the middle bit surrounding the headlight remains. Just like the Red Hens, the driver's cab on these cars only occupies the front corner of the cab. Passengers can't get right to the front because there's a walled-off crew area next to the cab. However, that wall contained a large window, allowing passengers to see out the front, just as they'd been able to on the Red Hens and Jumbos. Unfortunately, around the same time the new engines were fitted, these windows were replaced with frosted glass, bringing to an end some 6 decades of this Adelaide tradition. For the majority of their service lives so far, the 3000s have run as very short sets, most commonly 2 cars, made up of either a pair of single-ended 3100 class, a pair of double-ended 3000 class, or occasionally one of each. The double-ended cars regularly ran alone as single cars right up until 2020, when COVID measures required all trains to run as at least 2 cars to create more space for passengers, and this is something that has stuck ever since, with one-car trains now a thing of the past. From early 2025, this became a more formal arrangement, with some pairs of 3000 class getting modifications to become a more permanent pair. This included removing the old wall separating the crew area, creating slightly more passenger space, and installing covered gangways between the cars. The actual driver's cab remains intact, along with all the external stuff like lights and horns, so they can still be driven from that end if need be. The Bel Air line running into the Adelaide Hills attracts a lot of mountain bike riders, like a lot. I was there on a random weekday and they made up most of the passengers on the train. And to assist with this, several cars have been modified with a different seating layout, allowing space for lots of bikes in the middle. There is one more big part of the 3000 class story, but we're just going to jump to the next train to fill out some context, then we'll come back to it. In the early 2010s, some 6 decades after Adelaide had decided to go with diesel suburban trains, moves were finally made to begin electrification of the network, with 25 kilovolt AC overhead wiring. Bombardier Transportation won the contract to build South Australia's first ever fleet of electric multiple units. These trains were to be built at Bombardier's factory in Dandenong, Melbourne, and yes, that's the same factory once occupied by Comenge, where the first of the 3000 class were built. Where the 3000 class had essentially been a diesel version of a Melbourne Comenge, the new 4000 class EMUs for Adelaide have a strong family likeness to V-Line's Velocity DMUs, also built at Bombardier Dandenong, and you can also see many similarities with another Bombardier product, the B-Series EMUs for Perth, as well as the closely related Brisbane 260 class SMUs and 160 class IMUs. The 4000 class are made up of fixed 3-car sets comprised of a driving motor car at each end, sandwiching an intermediate unpowered trailer car, the same basic layout as 3-car sets in Melbourne. In a break from convention, their 4000 series number isn't actually a car number, it applies to the whole 3-car set, with each car then having a letter to distinguish itself. The motor cars at each end are A and B, and the trailer car is T. While capable of running in pairs as a 6-car train, this surprisingly doesn't currently happen in normal passenger service. An attempt was made to give these trains a catchy nickname, the A-City, like A for Adelaide City. But it seems to me this didn't really stick, and they mostly just get called the 4000 class. Since the interstate line to Adelaide had been converted to standard gauge in 1995, transferring these new trains from Melbourne by rail would have required placing them on temporary standard gauge transfer bogies, something that is absolutely possible. But unfortunately they went with the boring option of delivering the new fleet by road. In July 2015, I was driving home late one night in Melbourne's northeastern suburbs when I passed one of the new 4000 class cars heading the other way on the Greensboro Highway. I looped around past my house to grab my camera gear and managed to catch up to the movement on the Metropolitan Ring Road near Thomastown, taking this picture just before 2 AM. Also, according to my records, I then went on to take this picture at Glenroy just 6 hours later. This was before I had kids. Initially, Adelaide only electrified one major line, the Noarlunga line, extending it to Seaford in the process, and also the short branch to Tonsley, later extended to Flinders. At first, the newly electrified lines were run by a mixture of diesel 3000 class and electric 4000 class, with the Jumbos not permitted to operate under the overhead due to limited clearance on their elevated cabs. Once enough 4000s were delivered to operate all Seaford and Tonsley line services, the 3000s were cascaded to other lines, ultimately allowing the complete withdrawal of the Jumbos, which completed their last runs in August 2015. It wasn't until 2020 that Adelaide embarked on their next electrification project, the Gawler line, and another batch of 4000 class were ordered to cover this operation as well. Bombardier had been taken over by Alstom since the previous order, but they were built in the same factory to an identical design. The Gawler electrification project was extremely drawn out, with no trains running for an entire 18 months. That is a really, really long time and way more disruptive than it should have been. I think I've made my views pretty clear in the past on long-term bus replacements and why we should avoid them at all costs. But despite how this was handled, the final result is a much improved service, and I suggest you go check out Ralford's video on the reopening of the line. In 2024, the 3000 class underwent another change to their means of generating power, when they were converted to battery diesel hybrids. This involved fitting each car with a large battery, which can charge from the train's dynamic brake. The power in the battery can then be used to power the train's lights and air conditioning when it's stopped at stations, and can actually provide enough power back to the traction motors to allow the train to accelerate entirely on battery power with the diesel engine shut down in certain circumstances. This conversion was done to 50 of the 70 members of the class, with the unconverted cars being permanently retired. The conversion has an obvious benefit of reducing overall fuel use, apparently by around 16%, but there's also a few situations in Adelaide where there are more specific benefits. Adelaide's main station, Adelaide, is a hole. Don't get me wrong, the main entrance building is gorgeous, I'd say right up there with Sydney Central for the nicest main station in any Australian capital city, but unlike Central, the platforms at Adelaide were progressively covered over in the 1980s, and are now a hole. When the entire suburban fleet was diesel, this was a really noisy and exhaust-filled place, despite the extraction fans. But this has now been hugely improved, not just with the use of fully electric trains, but also now that the diesel railcars can shut off their engines as they enter the platform area. They can then depart under battery power, which doesn't produce any exhaust and hardly creates any noise at all. I was quite surprised when I hopped on an outer harbour train and it ran on full battery power, not just departing the platforms, but for the whole 2.5 kilometres out to the first station stop at Bowden. However, I was even more impressed by a trip out to Belair. Belair is in the Adelaide Hills, and the railway climbs continuously from around Goodwood all the way to the Suburban terminus. Going up the hill, the diesel engine was unsurprisingly working hard. However, on the return trip, the train ran entirely on battery power downhill from Belair for a full 10 kilometres to Linton, after which the diesel engine kicked in again. There are obviously lots of benefits that have come with this hybrid conversion. The reduced fuel use means cost savings and also reduced emissions, and the trains are much quieter, in certain situations at least, for passengers and for those living beside the line. However, I do have a few opinions on the implementation of this and what the actual motives might be. For starters, I think the way it's been sold to the public is a bit misleading. There's been a heavy focus on the environmental benefit of the reduced emissions, as if these are now an intrinsically environmentally friendly train, and they really don't want you to miss that, even sticking a big green stripe down the side in case you forget just how green they are. But out of Adelaide's 2 current types of train, the hybrid 3000s are still predominantly powered by diesel. While the 4000 class are fully electric, and I'm not seeing any green stripe on those. The difference in Adelaide is significant because the South Australian electricity grid is already at 70% renewables, more than any other state that isn't Tasmania, and that mix is only going to get better in years to come. To be clear, all trains, even diesel ones, play an important role in reducing emissions simply by shifting large numbers of people away from road transport. But if you're going to make a big deal about low emission trains specifically, the fully electric 4000 class, drawing straight from the South Australian grid, are the clear winners. Even with a small percentage of the grid powered by fossil fuels, the emissions from that are also not released locally. Unlike the 3000 class, the 4000s don't produce any exhaust at all in the places they actually run. If I can get a bit conspiratorial here, I think Adelaide has been a bit burned by their 2 big electrification projects so far, taking longer than they thought and costing more than they thought, and I think the prominent branding of the hybrid trains is designed to make a statement showing that proper electrification isn't needed on the remaining lines. This is the future now, and there has been mention of these trains being eventually replaced by fully battery-powered trains in the future. To be absolutely clear, I think the hybrid conversions are a good thing to apply to these existing diesel railcars. It's absolutely an improvement, but it can't be argued that it's the more environmentally friendly option compared to actual electrification of the remaining network. As for the future, trains powered entirely by battery are fine for low frequency, relatively low speed and short distance routes, but this is an intensive suburban service and would benefit from all the other reasons we electrify railways, not just emissions reduction. Conventional electric trains never need to refuel or recharge, they have access to effectively unlimited power, and they don't need to lug around a massive battery, the production of which has an environmental impact all of its own. Anyway, that was my very roundabout way of saying I care about reducing emissions, and if Adelaide wants to make that a priority, they should bite the bullet and do it properly with overhead wires. Also, that green stripe is just a disaster aesthetically. They look so much better black. Sorry, on with the video. So, as I'm making this video in 2025, the Gawler, Seaford and Flinders lines are operated by the 4000 class EMUs, with the rest of the network run by the now battery diesel 3000s. But let's take a look at where you can see preserved examples of the other types today. Lots of Red Hen cars have survived into preservation, and some of them have had quite interesting retirement careers since withdrawal in the 90s. There are lots of them preserved statically or on private property, far too many for me to cover here. But one very prominent example is this pair of 300 class on a private property beside the Belair line at Blackwood, easily viewed from passing trains. Probably the most interesting use of Red Hens in operational preservation began in 1994, when 6 Red Hen cars, plus the 3 Superchook cars, were privately purchased and transferred to the South Gippsland Railway in Victoria. They made the interstate trip under their own power in a series of transfer moves, and certainly would have made a very unusual sight passing through central Melbourne. The South Gippsland Railway was a volunteer-run tourist railway operating between Nyora and Leongatha, and they began using the Hens, including the Superchooks, for their regular weekend passenger operations. In 1999, 4 of the conventional cars plus the Superchooks were transferred to Bendigo, again under their own power, for a proposed mainline tourist venture which never progressed beyond a few test runs, and those cars remained in storage at Bendigo for several years. The remaining 2 cars at SGR, 402 and 311, continued in use into the 2000s, and it was during that time as a young rail fan that I visited the railway several times, where 402 was usually operating the service as a single car. I have very fond memories of these visits, and it gave me some experience riding Red Hens, even though I'd missed them in service, and in fact I'd never been to Adelaide at that stage. Sadly, the SGR wound up operations in 2016. The 2 cars changed owners and are now in storage on private property. Most of the cars stored at Bendigo, including the Superchooks, were transferred by road to the York Peninsula Railway in South Australia in around 2002, where the Superchooks and one of the 400 class operated for several years. The YPR had a radical blue, white and red livery, which I think looked really cool. However, it wasn't a long-lived situation, with that line closing permanently in 2009, after which the cars were dispersed off to private owners, with none of them operational today. South Gippsland and York Peninsula were not the only tourist railways to run Red Hens and later cease operations. A third railway fitting that description was the Limestone Coast Railway, which ran out of Mount Gambier over a number of routes between 1998 and 2006. Like York Peninsula, the Limestone Coast Railway came up with their own custom livery, painting their 3 cars, one 300 and 2 400s, in an attractive red-brown with a limestone-coloured stripe and roof. After the line closed due to rising public liability costs, these 3 cars moved to the Steamranger Heritage Railway, where 2 of them are still operational today, more on which in a moment. During the mid-90s withdrawal from service, the National Railway Museum in Adelaide acquired 2 cars, 321 and 400, as well as steel-bodied trailer car 875. This 3-car set was kept in operational condition and intermittently ran special tours on the Adelaide network up until 2006. There was a brief resurgence of mainline operations between 2013 and 2015, when the 2-car set, without the trailer, ran a number of shuttle days between the museum and Adelaide railway station, and I was lucky enough to ride one of these in December 2013. The only time I expect I will ever travel on a Red Hen on the Adelaide network. After 2015, the challenges and costs associated with keeping the train mainline accredited became too much, and the train now operates only within the museum compound during special events on their 600-metre section of track, which has since been completely disconnected from the main line. Unfortunately, South Australia doesn't have the widespread support for mainline preservation that we enjoy in Victoria and New South Wales, and it's a very difficult thing to restart once momentum is lost. However, we're still fortunate to be able to ride these cars on the short museum line. But the final and most positive part of the Red Hen preservation story belongs to the Steamranger Heritage Railway, which is a really remarkable 82-kilometre long tourist railway running between Mount Barker and Victor Harbour. Steamranger currently has 4 operational Red Hen cars, plus 1 example of each type of trailer car. The steel one is 875, the one that used to be at the NRM. Steamranger is now the only place you can travel on a Red Hen outside the museum, and I'll put a link down below if you're keen to experience it for yourself. A small number of jumbos have also made it into preservation, with a 2-car set going to Steamranger and another 2 cars going to the National Railway Museum. Hypothetically, either one of these could be made operational, although I'm told they're mechanically quite complex and there aren't many spare parts available, so only time will tell. However, if a jumbo does ever run again, I'll be the first to buy a ticket. In the meantime, there's easy public access to the set at the NRM, so it's still possible to get up close and personal with these remarkable rail cars. Alright, that's it. That was a much longer video than I initially planned. If you're in South Australia, make sure you pay a visit to Steamranger and or the National Railway Museum and go for a ride on a Red Hen. A big thank you to all the people who provided extra images and footage for this video, and as always to my patrons for making this production possible. Thank you very much for watching.
Welcome to Adelaide. This train will terminate